Well, that's the theme song for the book lunch. These little zingers, these little um, that they're that cats used to write in a 40-year period. And I'm kind of a little bit copying some of that style. Now it's interesting. I'm at the piano here playing this theme. Now this is one book, a Journey of an Aesthete podcast. We're just dealing with Hannah Arendt and dealing with her life of the mind. Now, it's a complex text. It's a dense text. It's a beautiful text, and we're still on volume 1. And, it's an unfinished work because she died while she was working on the last volume. And so we only have 2 volumes, Thinking and Willing. The 3rd volume, which she didn't get to really write, is called Judging. And in her view, these are the 3 aspects of mental life. And her formulation, again, my perspective in reading her work, and I've read all of her work, I think, including her correspondence with even Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers and Mary McCarthy, who we'll talk about, is less about, is she telling it like it really is, which is that mode of reading, which I don't really do, at least not always. I mean, if I were reading a scientific text or actual scientific literature, then I enter that kind of way of looking at things, but not for this kind of material. It's much closer to the arts, much closer to the humanities. It doesn't traffic in falsehood. In other words, it's indifferent to questions of truth. It's a kind of writing that's right on the edge in between imaginative literature and philosophy proper. It's right, and especially a continental thinker like Hannah Arendt, unlike, as I'll get into later, and I've said before, Anglo-American thought, which is tends to be much more hard-nosed and truth and falsity and empiricism. She comes out of a different thing. It's much more influenced by the French and the Germans, Kant, Hegel, German tradition, and we'll get into that in this episode. Anyhow, it's a long way of saying that we're dealing with a certain kind of thinker. And so I want to immediately talk about 3 great losses to the world of the arts. Emmett Walsh, one of the greatest actors of all time, was in everything, 70s, 80s, 90s, and hundreds of productions passed, I think about a week, 2 weeks ago. And so he's in some of my favorite movies. He will be talked about a lot, I think, because of Blood Simple, because he's sort of a lead in that, and that's a good film, but I like him better in Straight Time and Blade Runner and many other films. Joe Flaherty, again, a wonderful actor. Freaks and Geeks, he was the father on Judd Apatow's Freaks and Geeks, a wonderful show. Freaks and Geeks is good as anything that HBO and Netflix puts out in terms of quality and acting and writing. And he's known, I guess, was known as the dad on that series. And last but not least, getting into book world, John Barth passed, I think, today or last night at the age of 93. One of the major. I've covered Don DeLillo on my show, and I've talked about, for lack of a better word, postmodern art and postmodern literature. And in many ways, along with Thomas Pynchon and a couple other people, he was a back in the 60s and 70s, he was innovator in that mode of fictional prose. And if I had to recommend one John Barth book, I mean, first read Barth, oh God, as a teenager. I read The Saltweed Factor, and that's the book I would recommend. But of course, to read The Saltweed Factor, you got to read before that, in a way, Henry Fielding and Tom Jones and Pamela and Clarissa Richardson. There's a whole, and Lawrence Stearns, Tristram Shandy, and there's a whole tradition of a certain kind of 18th century, early 18th century sort of satirical prose that in large respect, John Barth was influenced by and responding to in his work. And so those are three guys, three artists in different realms of life, and I'm interested in all three of them. And I just thought I'd mention that up front, just to, sometimes when I do these shows I plan things. I'm like, well, I'm going to mention this, I'm going to mention that. I can't get to everything always, but I wanted to mention them before we dive into Hannah Arendt. Like Hannah Arendt, those three people were really great at what they did, and will have something to offer the present and the future as much as the past, hopefully. So, if people are open to it. So, I got this new upgraded version of Life of the Mind, Thinking. So now I kind of have editions that match. See? Which is, helpful. And I got my notes here. So I always say this, I don't quite know how to proceed. I mean, I do and I don't. So I'm going to just open it up, and we last, I think episode 2, we were getting deep into the sort of towards the what I would call the heart of volume 1. Now every book that's written, whether it's scientific or natural science, a textbook even, or a novella, or any kind of text, any kind of book has, and this is how I was trained. So I was trained in close reading, which we're going to do, but also I was trained in what I was taught is the imaginative center. The imaginative center is sort of, I want to be careful here, because when I name and label and identify unimaginative center, there's always the risk that we might forget about things that are separable from that center that might be as important. So again, I'm a pluralist, so I don't want to say, again, I don't want to do a disservice to Hannah Arendt and say, this book is about thinking. I mean, you could say that, it is, but it's about more than that. So I want to be careful. So I'm going to be very cautious and say there is an imaginative center, but I'm going to say it's not everything, but it's a lot. So the imaginative center of volume 1, which we're getting to now, the heart of, we're entering the heart now, is she has a clear idea of what it is to think, that she is attempting to elucidate and illuminate for the reader. And she also has a sense of where humanity has gone wrong. And I say gone wrong, I don't just mean the 20th century. I mean, she opens up her text, after all, talking about Nazism and Eichmann and the Adolf Eichmann trial. So clearly she's, thinking about this awful regime and these things that have happened. It's not only that, but it's not accidental. She starts off her text with, Nazis and all these awful things, the Shoah and the concentration camps and all that. But it's sort of to say that, humanity's gone wrong, and she has an account of that. And part of how we have gone wrong is, and she does blame some aspects of spiritual traditions, disregarding the physical, disregarding embodiment, disregarding appearances, saying appearances don't matter, or saying appearances are unreal or illusory. She's saying, on the contrary, appearances are all important. And so we left off with that when we talked about it, and she's going to get more into that. And sort of this, a kind of a certain, I want to say, misuse of Plato, where you say, well, there's the figure behind the curtain, the evil one doing things. These very all too common sort of supernatural, hyperbolic, hysterical notions that are popular now, unfortunately, quite a bit. There's this sort of ringleader behind the curtain doing these machinations, and then if we just see that that's not real and all this. This is all kind of like crap. For Hannah Arendt, these are all kind of like they're like weeds in the mind. Suzuki calls them mind weeds. They're sort of things that, and mind weeds, again, I want to be clear, mind weeds have some truth in them. In other words, it isn't that it's totally false, but that it's kind of like clogging the senses, clogging the mind. And she's attempting in this book 1 to sort of clear out, declutter and clear out these weeds of these received notions that appearances don't matter and that, daily life is an illusion, and saying, well, if that's your attitude, what are the consequences? If you're going to ignore your daily life and put it in a clear way if you have that attitude, and that's not good. And so she's going to, get us into this. I'm just had the long prelude to try to get situated because it's been a week or so, and I want to get back into, and that's where we left off. So I wanted to, again, we're doing a close reading, but I can't read every sentence. I can't read every paragraph. I can't. I won't, and I can't. But what we do look at, I think, will be important, and we're going to try to look at it closely and sort of, do that. It's kind. So I'm going to pick up here. Talked about appearance, talked about reality. So one of the next things she deals with in this text is science and common sense and reality and thinking and truth. That's right, truth and thinking. So she's going to, let's hear her talk about it. Now, prose is very important, and she's going to, where she's going to tackle this question head on of what reality is. And she does it through her syntax and her prose. And she opens up her book with W.H. Auden. Remember that poem? Well, there's a lot of quotes in front here. I'm trying to... does God ever judge us by appearances? I suspect that he does. W.H. Auden. I think that's Talking to Myself, or one of his poems. She returns to Auden. I think she and Auden were friends, of course, I believe. And I'm going to get out my glasses. She returns again to Auden. So you'll notice it's not accidental. She's already mentioned Augustine. She's already mentioned Aristotle and Plato. She's going to return again and mention Kant. She mentions Hegel. She mentions Marx. What's going on with that? Why is she mentioning these people? Well, part of it is that these are like part of the humanities, and she would say civilizational. Trying to find civilizational creation, in terms of prose and text, and so there's all this stuff. And she's going to mention other folks like Duns Scotus, Thomas Aquinas. She's going to deal with these folks. So among those folks is W.H. Auden. So what's she doing when she does that? Well, she's, in her way of thinking, those figures are alongside her. She's with them. She's communing with those figures, including Auden, poets. And we could enlarge that. It could be, I could talk to Bud Powell. I mean, not literally, but, or a jazz pianist. Or I could say, what, when I'm working on musical things, what did Oscar Peterson do in that phrase? It's kind of the power of influence and getting excited. And so in this similar way, it's going to sound like maybe a stretch, but for Hannah Arendt, Kant and Duns Scotus or kind of like her her piano players in a way, or kind of like her musicians, So I don't know. It's kind of an idea. So we're going to go to Science and Common Sense, which is I'm going to dive right into this because so this is in medias res. This is page 60, Science and Common Sense. She talks about, I said she's going to mention this theologian from the Middle Ages, Scotus, and she does. We'll start here. The source of mathematical truth is the human brain, and brain power, that's italicized, is no less natural, no less equipped to guide us through an appearing world than our senses plus common sense and the extension of it that Kant called intellect. That's Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant has said that there's this thing called intellect. And she's referring to that, right? The best proof of this may lie in the otherwise quite mysterious fact that mathematical reasoning, the purest activity of our brain, and at first glance, because of its abstraction from all qualities given to our senses, the farthest removed from sheer common sense reasoning, could play such an enormously liberating role in science's exploration of the universe. So she's dealing with their almighty science, almighty math, what today we call STEM. In 1972, she's writing about that same field, and she's saying this liberated us. This was a great thing. She's going to go on to say it's not everything. That's critically important to where but we'll get, just bear with it for a second here. Chair keeps moving around here. Gotta kind of, oh, I see what's happened. I gotta, good. Gotta get comfortable here. Yeah, it's not everything. And so then she goes on to talk about, liberating the intellect, the organ of knowledge and cognition, is still of this world. That is, it's not from somewhere else for her. It's of this world, just like the appearances of this world. So intellect is just, is like, in a way like this, maybe like the clothes I have on now for her. I don't know. Maybe it's really I don't know. It's of this world. It's worldly, okay? It's of this world. Still of this world. In the words of Duns Scotus, and Scotus was an important figure in Christian history, history of Christianity, history of metaphysics. And this is not the time and the place to get into the debate between Aquinas. I was going to say Paul Tillich, who I like better than Aquinas, but Aquinas and Augustine. I want to get into all that. You don't have to know all that now. Let's relax. But he had some very interesting ideas. And, again, Hannah Arendt was into this stuff. Hannah Arendt, after all, did her PhD on Augustine. So it's just the context of where she's coming from. In the words of Duns Scotus, it falls under the sway of nature. And then she's showing off her learning here, Latin, cedit sub natura, and carries with it all the necessities to which a living being endowed with sense organs and brain power is subject. And she goes on. The opposite of necessity is not contingency or accident, but freedom. As we may know, Hannah Arendt thinks very fondly of contingency. She thinks it's a real thing, and she thinks a lot. I think there's that quote where she says, all of history is contingency. Meaning it's not necessity, it's not deterministic. It's not like the far left and the far right both make this mistake, by the way. That's why they're both wrong. They all sort of think that things sort of follow in a clockwork fashion. We're going to have the revolution, and we're going to have this, or if we get rid of the nation state, we'll be free, and this and that, and all these kind of very crude, sort of, frankly, sometimes stupid formulas. So she's not saying that contingency is bad, but she is saying that you have necessity, and then you don't just have contingency or accident, you have freedom. And she says that everything that appears to human eyes, okay, everything that occurs to the human mind, everything that happens to mortals, for better or worse, is, in quotes, contingent. Told you she loved contingency. Including their own existence. we all know. And now she, drumroll, W.H. Auden's poem. Unpredictably decades ago, you arrived among that unending cascade of creatures spewed from nature's maw. A random event, says science. And then Arendt says, but that does not prevent us from answering with the poet. Back to Auden. Random my bottom, a true miracle, say I, for who is not certain that he was meant to be? See? Sit there on that. Now that's today, to this very day, look, this very hour, there are people debating now, actually I know some of them, in universities, in seminars, these very questions: free will, accident, evolution, Charles Darwin, all of these things. That's kind of, and so she's writing in 1972, and so in a sense we're still there. We haven't moved. We're still sort of kicking it around and kind of dealing with these things, right? And so she's Auden. Now Auden's an interesting figure. Auden, it's sort of a little bit funny. It's sort of a little bit like, the image of the cold scientist that thinks everything is predetermined and that we're machines. And Auden's saying, I know in my heart I was meant to be, and that life matters and value matters. And there's a little bit of that kind of caricature of these two straw men maybe, or sort of stand. But then she goes on, commenting on Auden's poem. In other words, there are no truths beyond and above factual truths. All scientific truths are factual truths, those engendered by sheer brain power. That's the third time in 2 pages she uses this phrase, brain power. One of the things I love about Arendt's prose is her use of common catchphrases that reflects her mastery of English, but that English is a second language for her. So remember entertainment value. She says the world is entertainment value, I think in the very early part of this text. And now she's talking about brain power. It's interesting. She's a complex thinker. She's a deeply intellectual thinker, but she's using, again, brain power, entertainment value, concepts that are relatable. The average person can say brain power, yeah? But maybe the brain is a muscle. We need to do exercises and read Kant, Hegel, and Hannah Arendt to exercise the brain like you exercise the body. I don't know. But I'm just saying, it's interesting. Brain power. Where was I? Okay. Sheer brain power and expressed in a specially designed sign language, not excluded. And only factual statements are scientifically verifiable. Thus, the statement, a triangle laughs, is not untrue but meaningless, whereas the old ontological demonstration of the existence of God as we find it in Anselm of Canterbury. So that's a reference, again, Arendt and her erudition and knowledge, she's read all this stuff, and I've read most of this stuff. I certainly read St. Anselm's. It's the proof for the. Actually, if we had time, I would run through his logical syllogism about greater than the thought can conceive, the mind conceive, God alone. Won't get into that now, but that's what she's referring. She's saying. So she goes on to say about that. She's saying it's not valid, and in this sense is not true. But it is full of meaning. So this is the getting towards the heart. We're not quite at the heart yet of her text. So she's saying there's stuff that's the domain of science, like gravity, and we can measure the ages of rocks. We could talk about, I don't know, was there a tribe that was egalitarian thousands and thousands of years ago? Or was that tribe hierarchical? I guess we could sort of find that out and make hay out of that. Or we could study that. There's kind of like, that's a more, interesting. I mean, the weight of rocks, ages of rocks is a little less interesting perhaps, unless you're a geologist, which I am not. But you take my point. Those are realms of fact. Is it snowing in a lot of the U.S. now? Yeah, there's a snowstorm going on. That's, and you can get out in the snow. There's the fact of the snow. There's the feeling of the snow, the beauty of the white snow coming down and the majesty of it. You can take that attitude towards it, of course, if you wanted to. But that attitude is dependent on the existence of snow, right? But she's saying something, and again, I'm not really sure whether I fully agree with Arendt'a on this, by the way. I said I love this book, but it's not a love born of, is she correct or not? It's a love of her prose and a love of her sense of wonder. And I'm not sure, I'm on the fence a little bit, but she says there's this other thing called meaning. And for her, meaning is distinct from fact. So that's what enables her to read people. She's not a believer in the sense of, she's not a Catholic. She's not Mary. Well, Mary McCarthy gave up her Catholic faith. I have to remember that. But Hannah Arendt, is not, she's a Jew and not a Christian. And she's not, when she reads Augustine and Duns Scotus, she's not reading them from the point of view of, is God real or not? She couldn't be less interested. She's interested in it from the point of view of, there's meaning here. It's interesting, right? Interesting distinction. It's a little hard. See, it's hard for us today, especially in today's climate, to wrap our brain around it because first of all, we're reading this series, this book, in a profoundly anti-intellectual age. I've got to say, I'm 56, lived through the 70s, 80s, 90s. I don't remember an age more hostile towards books and learning, more hostile towards respect for dead authors. I guess because they're out of date or don't conform to current political norms or whatever the reasons, or their personal behavior. Just hostile and, either indifferent, incurious, but also actively hostile towards learning. And, Richard Hofstadter wrote his book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, which is a great book. Another classic that I think bears rereading. He wrote that in the 50s, in the climate of Joseph McCarthy and the Red Scare and all that. And so that was the context of that text. But, if you reread Hofstadter's book, he could be talking about today because he talks about religious fundamentalism in Protestant sects in the American South and the Midwest, which Hofstadter studied. And connected with the George Wallace campaign. It gets very complex, right? So, so we're in it now in an age that's, very anti-intellectual, more, I should say, anti-intellectual than other ages. And from my point of view, that's a kind of a drag. I don't dig it, but that's, you live with what you live in the age that you are. But part of that, I only go on and on about that because part of the anti-intellectual ethic, if there is one, I can respect it. So let's take it seriously. Let's take seriously anti-intellectualism as a worldview. Part of that ethic is anti-intellectuals get very hung up on two things. They get hung up on what's it good for? What's the use of this? Kind of, if I can't use it for something, it's a waste of my time. That. And also gets unduly hung up on, is that true or not? It's curious, isn't it? We live in a time in which there's enormous lies and deceit and disinformation and misinformation. And it's interesting that that's happening at the same time that we're obsessed with truth and falsity. As truth and falsity. It's an interesting, maybe there's a connection between those two things. In other words, a little like the spirit of homeopathy, sort of Thomas More writes in Care of the Soul, he says, you obsess about things you don't have, or obsess about things when actually, so it's kind of like, our anxiety about truth and anxiety about all of that. Well, Thomas More would say, and he's borrowing from Sigmund Freud, and I think Freud gets that right. Again, as you know, I reject a lot of Freud, but Freud says that you emphasize that which you don't have. And so you say, I have this. It's like somebody that talks a lot about their conquest, or talks a lot about what they've done when they've done nothing. It's that kind of Freud has in mind. So in a way, our obsession with truth and falsity goes along with the fact that we're filled with untruths at every turn, and we believe lies and conspiracy theories at every turn, all the while saying, I want to get at the truth. You know, it's kind of like there's a little dance there between those two things. Anyhow, that's the context that we're doing this series. And so, you know, she's saying, you know, meaning. So what's meaning, right? What does Hannah Arendt mean by meaning? You know, we've read texts on this show where thinkers have attacked meaning. Jean Baudrillard, you know, America says that we have too much meaning. He says we're suffocating on meaning, is his phrase. Other thinkers would say that, you know, we lack meaning, the meaning crisis. I mean, these are all the points of view out there now. But what Arendt is saying, okay. She says, knowing certainly aims at truth, even if this truth, as in the sciences, okay, even if this truth, as in the sciences, is never an abiding truth, but a provisional verity that we expect to exchange against other, more accurate verities as knowledge progresses. To expect truth to come from thinking signifies that we mistake the need to think with the urge to know. So she's getting a little closer. She's saying that she's saying that we're confusing, that sometimes we should, I think what she might be saying is sometimes she would be happier if we were less consumed by the urge to know, that is, consume information, than if we really went into actual thinking, which for her is actually separate from what I know it's interesting, right? She's saying, you know, these are, in the continental tradition Arendt is working in, these are fine-combed, these differences, right? Thinking, urge to know, want to know. Thinking can and must be employed in the attempt to know, but in the exercise of this function, it is never itself. It is but the handmaiden of an altogether different enterprise. Okay, interesting. And she goes, there's a side, in parentheses here, she says, Hegel seems to have been the first to protest against the modern development that tends to put philosophy in a position similar to the one it had in the Middle Ages. And then she goes on to quote Hegel. So, again, she quoted Scotus, who was a major figure in the Middle Ages, and now she's saying, Hegel's saying, boy, in the Middle Ages, they kind of screwed this up a little bit. Well, what did they screw up? Then philosophy was supposed to be the handmaiden of theology, humbly accepting its achievements and asked to bring them into the clean, logical order and present them in a plausible, conceptually demonstrable context. Now, philosophy is supposed to be the handmaiden of the other sciences. Its task is to demonstrate the methods of the sciences, something Hegel denounces as, quote, catching the shadow of shadows, unquote. Arendt goes on, truth is what we are compelled to admit by the nature either of our senses or our brain. The proposition that everybody who is was meant to be, quoting the Auden poem we just read, meant to be, will survive refutation intact because it is inherent in every thinking reflection on the I am. By drawing a distinguishing line between truth and meaning, between knowing and thinking, and by insisting on its importance, I do not wish to deny that thinking's quest for meaning and knowledge's quest for truth are connected. So she's holding off on that phrase there. She's trying to say, wait a second, I'm not saying that these things aren't connected. So in Arendt'a, things are both distinct and connected. They're separate and yet connected, right? That's kind of the mode that she's in now. So she's saying, wait up. By posing the unanswerable questions of meaning, men establish themselves as question-asking beings. Behind all the cognitive questions for which men find answers, there lurk their unanswerable ones that seem entirely idle and have always been denounced as such. Okay, it is more than likely that men, if they were ever to lose the appetite for meaning we call thinking and cease to ask unanswerable questions, will lose not only the ability to produce these thought things, that's a phrase she has, thought things, that we call works of art, but also the capacity to ask all the answerable questions upon which every civilization is founded. So that's some serious business there. She's saying we should ask questions we know we will never find the answers. She's saying we should not, she's actually saying that we should not discard that as a waste of time. And she's saying something more radical. She's saying if we give up the desire to ask questions without, and if we give up the desire to just ask the question, just to ask it, give up our egoic desire to expect an answer, if we stop doing that, thinking it's a waste of our time, she's saying art will disappear itself. She's saying we'll also lose the ability to even inquire about what we can confidently expect answers to, if I could put it that way. So she's saying it's trouble on all fronts, I think, in a way. We have to sit with that a little bit. I mean, the technical term is aporetic, right? A-P-O-R-E-T. I say it's all of Socrates' old stuff, like what is justice? What is equality? What is love? What is freedom? What is music? Can music be silent, or does music have to have triads? We know that's music, but is this music? Now, I would say both those things I just blurted out they're both music. But there are many people that would only accept the first as true music, right? That gets to the question, like, what is music? What is sound? And, hopefully, the point of view of Arendt'a, I think, and certainly my point of view in this podcast, is just the joy of asking the question itself. And the sense of wonder and curiosity, close to a child's sense of wonder, actually, I think, and curiosity themselves, right, is part of the point. And as I said earlier, in an anti-intellectual age, the only concern is, are you getting it right? I think, right? And then when you think you're getting it right, you surely have to force others to get it as you get it. Maybe at the head of a gun, if need be, right? That could be the consequence of that kind of, I got it, now you're going to get it, right? Kind of thing, like, the truth. All kinds of fanaticism, all kinds of dogmatism, right? So that's a little bit. So she's saying art could disappear. In this sense, reason is the a priori condition of the intellect and of cognition. It is because reason and intellect are so connected, despite utter difference in mood and purpose, that the philosophers have always been tempted to accept a criterion of truth so valid for science and everyday life as applicable to their own rather extraordinary business as well. So she's saying that these things are connected, that they are connected, has tempted philosophers to go a little bit astray. See? It's sort of like a bit of a superficial connection. And the superficial connection, I think, disguises the interior difference or separation, if I can put it that way. It's kind of a little bit, I'm trying. For our desire to know, whether arising out of practical or purely theoretical perplexities, can be fulfilled when it reaches its prescribed goal. And while our thirst for knowledge may be unquenchable, because of the immensity of the unknown, the activity itself leaves behind a growing treasure of knowledge that is retained and kept in store by every civilization as part and parcel of its world. See, she's in a way doubling down. I don't know if that's she's saying, I'm going to emphasize this. We aren't going to get the answers we may want. And yet, we must keep asking. We must keep exploring, all the while respecting the mystery or mysteries. It's again, I'm a little bit humble because I don't, I'm trying to do justice to Arendt'a, degree which I can. I mean, I guess it helps a little bit that I've read all this stuff maybe, but this is the first time, in public trying to talk about it and using current events maybe or topical things and using sort of, I don't know, but kind of go ahead a little bit. So every civilization has built up this treasure trove, treasure knowledge. The loss of this accumulation and of the technical expertise required to conserve and increase it inevitably spells the end of this particular world. The thinking activity, on the contrary, leaves nothing so tangible behind, and the need to think can therefore never be stilled by the insights of, in quotes, wise men. I'm going to skip a little bit because she goes on to talk about Kant. And Kant had the distinction between the Vernunft and the Verstand. These two, Vernunft and Verstand. Again, my German is terrible. Both capitalized V. And that's between a faculty of speculative thought and the ability to know arising out of sense experience. So it's the old kind of, I guess, binary dichotomy of I see this Think coffee cup. I'm going to drink from it with the right hand. I should use my left hand so you can see the Think logo. This cup appears to me, but I could think of a concept like freedom or liberty, and that's not readily as apparent as this cup. I think that's kind of the, and then she quotes Kant here, all thought is but a means to reach intuition. In whatever manner and by whatever means a cognition may relate to objects, intuition, it's italicized, is that through which it is immediately relation to them, and to which all thought is directed as a means. And that's from Kant. She's quoting Immanuel Kant. She has consequences more far-reaching, and even perhaps quite other than those Kant himself recognized. And that's coming from the Critique of Pure Reason. Again, let's not worry about it if you haven't read Critique of Pure Reason or and she goes on to mention Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. I'm going to go to mental activities in the world of appearances. This is 2. It's coming back to appearances again. I hate to skip over some of this stuff, but we have to. I mean, again, I can't do every sentence. There's a lot here. I'm trying to... Okay, we're gonna go deep, we're gonna go a little bit, skip some of these pages. We're in a chapter called Invisibility and Withdrawal, which is in the second part, mental activities in a world of appearances. So she's going to be toying with, things that are invisible, mysterious, and withdrawal. That's the ascetic, right? The hermit or the monk or the contemplative. I'm going to withdraw from the world. It's talking about that. And she says something interesting here. She says, it would be wrong, I believe, to try to establish a hierarchical order among the mind's activities. But I also believe that it is hardly deniable that an order of priorities exists. It is inconceivable how we would ever be able to will or to judge, that is, to handle things which are not yet and things which are no more. No more is the past, memory. Not yet is hope, right? People talk these days about the party of memory and hope. I don't know. Hope is not yet, maybe, or hope is now. And I don't know, the future, right? Is inconceivable how we will or judge as handle things which are not yet and things which are no more. If, it would be inconceivable if, right, the power of representation and the effort necessary to direct mental attention to what in every way escapes the attention of sense perception had not gone ahead and prepared the mind for further reflection as well as for willing and judging. Now that's a mouthful. And again, in this continental tradition, there's a lot of subordinate clauses, but it's necessary. Okay, let's dig into that. So she's saying, there's not a hierarchy, but there's priorities, and it would be inconceivable. She's saying we would never be able to will or judge, that is, handle things which are not yet the future. Things which are no more are memories, the past, loved ones that have passed, maybe past eras. She's saying we would not be able to handle such things if the power of representation and the effort necessary to direct mental attention to what in every way escapes the attention of sense perception had not gone ahead and prepared the mind for further reflection as well. So she's saying mental attention, escaped attention of sense perception, this is the critical clause, had not gone ahead and prepared the mind for further reflection as well as for willing and judging. So she's saying there's a faculty or an energy that has already prepared us. Remember in the very beginning of this series, I said we are born well equipped. She's saying we were born equipped. It's a similar, she's connected. She's saying we're equipped. She's saying there's this mysterious faculty that has already prepared our mind to deal with things. See, again, it would be a mistake to see Arendt'a as a stern, severe German, only. No, there's actually I got to say, there's a romantic, lyrical, we're equipped, is what she's saying. It's interesting, right? And she's saying, moreover, she's not only saying that we're quit, but she's saying we could obsess too much, actually, about that very thing. Which for her is actually not to think at all. So we have a little bit, we're getting close to the heart. So thinking is not ruminating or obsessive thinking. It's not even thinking. Again, she has a narrow definition of what thinking is. We're going to get close to what that is. We're getting to it. Maybe it's almost one, but I think I'll maybe leave that for another episode because it's not. In other words, what we generally call thinking, though unable to move the will or provide judgment with general rules, must prepare the particulars given to the senses in such a way that the mind is able to handle them in their absence. It must, in brief, de-sense them. That's de-sense, like deactivate. So she's saying, it's interesting, she just got through, 40 pages extolling the importance of senses and appearances. And here in this paragraph, she's saying, and yet, the mind has to de-sense, has to decompress, has to handle this other thing. That's interesting. So there's immense complexity in Arendt's text because she's honoring senses and honoring appearance, but she's saying the mind has to prepare us to, again, it is connected to contemplative life, by the way, what she's talking about. You've got to turn off the senses to do, and sort of. So we need both. And again, this is a very rich text, and it's a very, and I feel in this series that I'm kind of getting closer, reading this. And I'm doing it in public, I mean, it's crazy. I don't know. I'm trying to, we're trying to go forward with this. Representation. So instead of just saying representation, she goes re-presentation. Like she did with de-sense, d/sense, or sense. Representation, making present what is actually absent, is the mind's unique gift. And since our whole mental terminology is based on metaphors drawn from vision's experience, the gift is called imagination. Imagination is italicized. Defined by Kant as, quote, the faculty of intuition even without the presence of the object, unquote. So, intuition, imagination. She's saying that's a gift. And so I started off this episode talking about Joe Flaherty, the actor, who played this dad on this TV series. And I'm saying that's a work of representation. It's representing these high school kids and this family. In a show written by Judd Apatow called Freaks and Geeks. That's a work of art representing an aspect of life. That's representation too, right? John Barth in The Saltweed Factor represents a whole period of time that's utterly remote to us because it's not 19th century, it's not 18th, it's like, he's dealing with the 1600s and way remote in time. And making jokes about that in that novel. So you have to, not only do you have to deal with that time period, you got to know enough about it to get some of Barth's jokes and allusions. Those are all two kinds of representation. And she's saying they are gifts. Well, I'm going to stop there. I don't know. I did my best. We're getting into the heart, I want to save something for another episode. We have some show coming up with one of my favorite musicians, Pete Chrisley, great saxophonist. This month, I think, April. That's coming out. I have a concert coming up on the 24th of my trio. I'll be here. Those are things coming up, and I look forward to them. And I hope you tune in, and I hope you have a great weekend. And if there's anything I've forgotten, I'll get to it in the next episode. And I do hope you enjoyed this discussion of Arendt'a. Thank you. I want to thank everybody here, Peter, Yvette, all these wonderful people. Thanks for showing up and tuning in. And to be continued. Thank you.